Okay, so the learner today, we are diving into this really interesting conversation that you sent our way.
Yeah.
It's a recent episode of the Joe Rogan Experience,
Right.
and it features comedian Kyle Dunnigan, who,
Yeah, absolutely.
always a funny guy.
Yeah.
And, we are going to pull out some of the highlights from this sprawling conversation.
Yeah.
Everything from trying to make it in Hollywood to some pretty out there ideas about ancient civilization.
I mean, yeah, they really went all over the place with this one.
Yeah.
It's one of those where you start in one place and then just kind of keep going down these rabbit holes.
Right, exactly.
Which is, often what happens with Rogan. He just kind of, wherever the conversation takes them,
Yeah.
they follow that path. And
Yeah. And
so we're going to try to do the same and highlight some of those rabbit holes for you.
yeah, I mean, for me, I think what makes this episode so compelling is that you have two comedians
Right.
who've really seen it all. They've been in the trenches of the entertainment industry.
Mm-hmm.
They have really interesting takes on society and culture.
Yeah.
And, they're not afraid to go down those rabbit holes and explore some really
Right.
kind of far out ideas.
Absolutely. And I think the fact that you've got two comedians makes it even more interesting because you're getting this kind of unique perspective on things. It's not
Yeah.
just your typical, kind of serious academic discussion.
Yeah.
It's a little bit more lighthearted, a little bit more willing to poke fun at things. And
Yeah.
but also to, delve into some serious topics, but with a sense of humor.
Right, exactly. So the learner, what we're going to do is we're going to pull out
Right.
those key moments.
Yes.
The surprising facts,
Yeah.
the, humorous perspectives that really stand out. And we're going to kind of condense it for you.
Yeah.
So you don't have to listen to the whole 4 hours.
Exactly. We've done the hard work for you.
Right, exactly.
So you can sit back, relax, and enjoy the ride.
Okay, so where should we start?
Well, I mean, I think one of the most interesting parts of this whole conversation is Dunnigan's experiences in Hollywood
Okay,
and specifically trying to make it as a sitcom actor.
okay.
So he talks about,
Yeah.
that he went on like thousands of auditions
Wow.
and just could never really land a sitcom role.
Really?
Yeah.
So he auditioned thousands of times and never got a sitcom role.
Never got a sitcom role, which is just crazy to think about because, he's a funny guy.
Yeah.
He's talented,
Yeah.
he's got, good looks. He's got everything going for him,
Yeah.
but he just could never crack that code.
Wow.
And, it's one of those things where you hear that and you think, man,
Yeah.
show business is tough.
Yeah.
And it's not always about talent.
Yeah.
It's about timing. It's about, it's
Yeah.
about all these other factors that come into play.
Yeah. And so what's really interesting is that he was told later that he would have been a major get for the Big Bang Theory.
Oh, yeah, I remember that part.
Right.
That was crazy.
Like, can you imagine? Like, that's just how, fickle
Yeah.
Hollywood is.
I know, it's one of those what ifs,
Right.
Like, what if he had gotten that role? His whole life could be totally different.
Exactly.
And the Big Bang Theory obviously became this huge phenomenon.
That's crazy.
And, it's just one of those things where I think, man, like, sometimes it's just about being in the right place at the right time.
Yeah.
Or not being in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Yeah. But, it does say something about his resilience,
Oh, yeah, for sure.
right? To go on thousands of auditions.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you even keep going after that?
I don't know. I think you have to have a certain amount of, delusion almost
Right.
to be in show business.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to believe in yourself so much. And you have to have this, this fire in your belly that just keeps you going.
Yeah.
Because the rejection is just constant. It's just
Yeah.
part of the game.
Right.
And, I think a lot of people would just give up after, 10 auditions, 20 auditions, 100 auditions.
Yeah.
But to go on thousands,
Yeah.
that's a special kind of crazy.
I know. Well, and he's a funny guy, like you said.
Yeah.
He does have all the right stuff.
He does.
But it's interesting, too. He talked about, the actual audition process.
Oh, yeah.
And how demeaning it can feel.
Yeah.
And he made this analogy about how it's like, the casting directors are the kings.
Yeah.
The actors are the peasants,
Right.
begging for a bowl of soup.
Yeah, I love that analogy.
Yeah.
It's so true, though. You're just
Mhm.
sitting there in this waiting room with all these other actors, and
Yeah.
you're all just hoping that you get picked.
Yeah.
And you're just, you're putting yourself out there, and it's very vulnerable. And, sometimes you get the role and sometimes you don't.
Yeah.
And it's not always about, who's the best actor. It's
Right.
about who fits the part.
Yeah.
It's about who the casting director likes.
Right.
It's about, all these other factors.
Yeah, and it sounds like he really did have some kind of tough experiences in those audition rooms.
He did. He definitely had some stories about, going into these rooms and just feeling like he was being judged and, not always fairly.
Yeah, so he went on thousands of auditions, never got a sitcom role.
Right.
But he did mention a couple of shows that he worked on.
He did, yeah.
What were those?
So he talked about Hardball, which was this baseball show that sadly only lasted 6 episodes.
Oh, wow. So short-lived.
Yeah, it was really short-lived.
Yeah.
But he seemed to have a good time on that show. And then, of course, he talked about News Radio.
Okay, that's a classic.
Yeah, which is a beloved sitcom. And he actually got that role after a development deal with NBC fell apart because Ray Romano was fired from another pilot.
Wow. Talk about like a sliding doors moment.
I know, right? One person's misfortune is another person's opportunity. And so he kind of stumbled into that role.
Yeah.
But, he made the most of it, and he was great on that show.
Yeah. I mean, what's interesting is that he was on News Radio, which is a very successful show.
Right.
And he had great experience, working with a hilarious cast.
Right.
Brilliant writers.
Yeah.
But he admitted that he was actually eager to leave and get back to stand-up.
He did, yeah. And I think that says a lot about his personality and his kind of comedic sensibilities.
Yeah.
He's someone who really values that creative control, that direct connection with the audience that you get from stand-up.
Right.
And he wasn't as interested in, being part of this big machine that is a sitcom.
Yeah.
Even if it was a successful sitcom.
Yeah. I mean, he said he wasn't a fan of all the schmoozing and the politics of Hollywood.
Exactly. And, I think a lot of comedians feel that way. It's not really why they got into comedy.
Yeah.
They got into comedy to make people laugh.
Right.
To express themselves, to, be creative, and all that other stuff just kind of comes with the territory.
Yeah.
But it's not really what they're passionate about. And I think that's what you see with Dunnigan.
Okay, so let's move on to his experiences working on sketch shows.
Okay.
He talked about being on Cedric the Entertainer's sketch show.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
And this was around 2003.
Right.
And he kind of jokingly referred to himself as the token white guy.
Yeah. Yeah, that's funny.
Which, looking back, I guess that was a different time.
It was a different time for sure.
Yeah.
And, he was on that show with some really talented people, including Louis C.K., who was a writer on the show at the time. Yep. So it was a really interesting mix of people.
Yeah. And it sounds like the show actually had decent ratings.
Yeah, they were doing pretty well.
But then it got canceled.
Yeah.
So what happened there?
So from what I remember, he said there was some kind of conflict between Cedric and the Fox executives.
Oh, okay.
And then Wanda Sykes' show was doing really well in their time slot. So I guess they just decided to cancel Cedric's show and give Wanda more episodes.
Oh, wow. So it's like sometimes, even if the show's doing well, there's all these other factors that come into play.
Exactly. It's not just about the ratings. It's about, network politics and who's got the power and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So even though the show had decent ratings, it got canceled because of various other reasons.
Right.
Which is
and it's just another example of how unpredictable show business can be.
Yeah.
You think you're doing well, and then suddenly the rug gets pulled out from under you.
Yeah. And he also talked about the culture of stardom versus just trying to make it.
Yeah.
And he talked about how some movie stars would like big-time people on the set of News Radio.
Right.
Which sounds pretty unpleasant.
Yeah.
But then he also said that John Ritter was super kind and down to earth.
Yeah, he really loved John Ritter.
Yeah.
He said he was just a genuinely nice guy who treated everyone with respect.
Yeah. And he even said that what the biggest moments of his career was actually overshadowed by the start of the Iraq War.
I remember that.
Yeah, tell me about that.
So he had this big coming out episode on Cedric's show.
Yeah.
And it was a really big deal for him.
Yeah.
And but it just so happened that the episode aired the same day that the Iraq War started.
Oh, wow.
And so all the news coverage was obviously focused on the war.
Yeah.
And nobody was really paying attention to his episode.
Wow. Talk about bad timing.
I know, right?
Like, of all days for the war to start.
It's just one of those things where you're just like, are you kidding me?
Yeah.
Like, what are the chances?
Yeah.
But, it's just another example of how real world events can just completely overshadow what's happening in the entertainment world. I mean, no matter how big your episode is, if a war breaks out, it's going to be overshadowed.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about what Rogan and Dunnigan had to say about sketch shows in general.
Okay.
They talked about how difficult it is to create a successful sketch show.
Yeah.
And they referenced the early magic of SNL.
Right.
And how those early cast members had this really great chemistry.
Yeah. I think a lot of it comes down to the fact that they all kind of came up together.
Yeah.
They were all part of this improv scene in New York.
Right.
So they already had this rapport.
Yeah.
It was kind of shorthand. And they just understood each other's humor.
Right.
And that's something that's really hard to replicate.
Yeah. And they also talked about the importance of having writers who really understand the performers.
Oh, yeah, that's huge.
And their comedic strengths.
Yeah.
And being able to write material that's tailored to them.
Yeah, because, you can have the funniest writers in the world.
Yeah.
But if they don't get the performers,
yeah,
then the material's not going to work.
Right.
It's just going to fall flat.
Right. So it really is kind of a magic formula.
It is, yeah.
It's the right combination of talent, chemistry,
yeah,
and, good material.
Yeah. And timing.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's just about timing.
Right.
You can have everything else.
Right.
But if the timing's not right, it's not going to work.
Okay, so they talked a lot about kind of the evolution of comedy.
Yeah.
And what initially draws people to it.
Yeah.
Versus, what keeps them going.
Yeah. I think a lot of people get into comedy because they want attention. They like the idea of being on stage, making people laugh, getting that applause.
Yeah.
But I think the people who stick with it are the ones who really love the craft,
right?
Who love the challenge of writing jokes, of performing, of honing their skills. Yeah. And I think that's what you see with Dunnigan. He's someone who really takes his craft seriously, and he's always trying to get better. Yeah. And I think that's why he's been so successful.
Yeah. And he talked about being told to focus on his viral YouTube videos.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
But, this was back in the late 2000s.
Right.
When podcasting and online content creation weren't really seen as viable career paths.
Yeah, it was a different time. Yeah. People weren't really making money off of YouTube or podcasting. It was just something that people did for fun. Yeah. And so I think a lot of people were kind of skeptical of this idea that you could actually make a living doing this stuff online.
Right. It was really seen as kind of a side hustle. Yeah. Not a legitimate career.
Exactly.
Yeah. And he even mentioned Anthony Cumilla's early podcasting efforts and Tom Green's internet show as examples of people who were just kind of doing it for the love of it.
Yeah, just pure passion projects.
Yeah.
They weren't trying to get rich. Yeah. They weren't trying to become famous.
Yeah.
They were just doing it because they enjoyed it.
Right.
And they wanted to connect with an audience.
Right. And it's interesting because, now those early efforts are kind of seen as like trailblazing.
Oh, yeah. They were definitely ahead of their time. They were pioneers. They helped to pave the way for what we have now, which is this whole ecosystem of online content creation, where people are making millions of dollars.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Just by, putting themselves out there online.
Yeah. So it's just another example of how, things have really changed in the entertainment industry and how, what was once seen as kind of a fringe thing is now mainstream.
Exactly.
They also talked about Zach Galifianakis and how he didn't seem interested in doing a sitcom. Right. Which Dunnigan found hard to believe at first.
I mean, it's kind of counterintuitive, right? Yeah. Because you think, okay, you're a comedian. Yeah. You're successful. Yeah. You've got this big movie career. Why wouldn't you want to do a sitcom? Right. But I think Galifianakis is just a different kind of comedian. Yeah. He's not really interested in the fame and the fortune. Right. He's more interested in doing his own thing. Yeah. He wants to have creative control. Right. He wants to do projects that he believes in. Right. And he doesn't really care about the rest of it. Yeah. And I think that's admirable. Yeah. It's rare to find someone in Hollywood who's not driven by ego, who's not driven by money, who's just driven by their art.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about some of the comedians that they mentioned, kind of their comedic styles. Yeah. They talked about Brody Stevens.
Oh, yeah. Rest in peace. Brody, he was a legend. Yeah. He had this incredible energy on stage, and he was just so unique.
Yeah.
And they said that his comedy couldn't really be captured on paper.
Like you had to see him live.
You have to see him live to really appreciate it. And they even compared him to Andy Kaufman.
Yeah.
Which is a pretty high compliment.
Yeah, totally.
You know, Andy Kaufman was this kind of comedic genius who was always pushing boundaries and challenging people's expectations.
Yeah.
And I think Brody had a similar kind of spirit. He was always trying to do something different, something unexpected, and he wasn't afraid to fail, which is something that's really important in comedy.
Yeah.
You know, you have to be willing to bomb, to take risks, to push the envelope.
Yeah.
And I think Brody did that better than anyone.
Yeah. And they also mentioned Brian Holtzman.
Oh, yeah.
Who's known for being pretty wild and boundary pushing.
Yeah, he's definitely out there.
Yeah.
But he's hilarious.
Yeah.
He's one of those comedians where you're just like, I can't believe he just said that.
Yeah.
But you're laughing at the same time.
Yeah.
He's just got this kind of fearless quality.
Yeah.
And he doesn't care what people think.
Yeah.
And I think that's what makes him so funny.
Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit.
Okay.
And talk about Rogan's story about Jack Nicholson.
Oh, yeah, that was a good one.
Yeah, so Rogan was talking about Jack Nicholson flirting with Jennifer Lawrence.
Right.
And, you know, he was just emphasizing how effortlessly cool Nicholson is.
Yeah.
I mean, he's like a legend.
He's an icon. You know, he's been there, done that.
Yeah.
He's seen it all.
Yeah.
And he just exudes this kind of confidence, this charisma that's just undeniable.
Yeah, and it sounds like even Jennifer Lawrence, who's no slouch herself, was kind of like starstruck.
Yeah, I mean, who wouldn't be?
Yeah.
You know, Jack Nicholson's Jack Nicholson.
Yeah.
He's one of the greats.
Yeah, and they also talked about how you kind of need crazy people to make good movies.
Yeah.
And they brought up Daniel Day-Lewis and his method acting.
Yeah.
Which, you know, can be pretty intense.
Oh, yeah. He's known for going all out for his roles.
Yeah.
Like, he'll stay in character for months.
Really?
Yeah, even when he's not filming.
Wow.
He'll just live as that character.
So he, like, fully immerses himself?
He fully immerses himself.
Oh, wow.
And, you know, it can be pretty intense for the people around him.
Not bad.
But, you know, it results in these incredible performances.
Right.
And they specifically mention there will be blood.
Oh, yeah. That's a classic. And that iconic I drink your milkshake scene.
Oh, yeah. That's such a great scene.
Yeah.
It's so intense and so disturbing.
Yeah.
And so brilliant.
Right.
All at the same time.
Yeah. And it's interesting because, you know, they talked about how there's this fine line between dedication and like going too far.
Yeah.
With method acting.
Yeah.
They brought up Jared Leto.
Right.
And his behavior as the Joker.
Yeah.
And then there was that story about Christian Bale on the set of The Batman and how he was like really intense and methody.
Yeah.
And of course, Bale's known for his like extreme weight loss for The Machinist.
Yeah.
So it's like, where do you draw the line?
Right. I mean, it's one thing to be dedicated to your craft.
Yeah.
But it's another thing to be, you know, a complete jerk to everyone around you. And I think there's some actors who take it too far and they use method acting as an excuse to be difficult, to be demanding, to be abusive.
Yeah. And it sounds like Dunnigan had a pretty weird audition experience.
Oh, yeah. He told that story.
For a Gus Van Sant film.
Right.
Starring Joaquin Phoenix.
Yeah.
And he said there was like no direction.
Yeah.
And it was very confusing.
Yeah. He went in and he just had no idea what was going on.
Yeah.
And he said that Joaquin Phoenix was just kind of like sitting there, not really doing anything.
Yeah.
And he was just like, what is happening?
Yeah.
And then he didn't get the role.
Yeah. So it's just one of those things where even when you're working with like a big name director and a big name actor, things can still be really weird and unpredictable.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's move on to some of their health diet stuff.
Okay.
They talked about sun exposure and meat consumption.
Yeah, right.
And they talked about the healthy user bias.
Yeah.
And the fact that, you know, most of the planet eats meat.
Right.
They did mention Martin Burkhan.
Yeah.
A vegetarian boxer as a kind of an exception.
Yeah.
But, you know, overall they were saying that
yeah,
a balanced diet is important.
Right,
and if you're going to be vegetarian, you really need to do it right.
You need to do your research. Yeah. You need to talk to a professional. You need to make sure you're getting all the nutrients you need.
Yeah.
Because it's not easy to be a healthy vegetarian.
And it can be done.
It can be done.
But you just have to be very mindful of it.
Right. Exactly.
Okay, so then Dunnigan shared this interesting theory.
Oh, yeah.
About younger generations being more open about sharing compliments.
Yeah.
And he attributed it to Facebook.
Right.
So what was his reasoning there?
Well, he was saying that because Facebook is so public, you get these notifications when people like your posts or comment on your photos. Right. And so it's almost like you're being conditioned to share these compliments because everyone's seeing them anyway. Right. So it's not as big of a deal to just be like, oh, yeah, someone said I looked great in this photo, or someone said this was a really funny post. Yeah. Whereas in the past, you wouldn't really share those things because it would seem kind of arrogant. Yeah. But now it's just normal. It's just part of the culture.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's something to that.
Yeah, I think it makes sense. Yeah. I've definitely noticed that younger people are more comfortable talking about their accomplishments and sharing praise. Yeah. And I think a lot of that is due to social media.
Yeah, I think so too.
It's just become more acceptable to toot your own horn a little bit.
Okay. And then they talked about Dunnigan's Caitlyn Jenner impression.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
And how he uses face swap technology. Yeah. And how Comedy Central tried to replicate it with higher level technology. Yeah. But he felt like it missed the point.
Yeah. He said it was too polished. Yeah. It lost the charm of the original.
Yeah. And he also talked about the rise of the Kill Tony show.
Oh, yeah, that's a great show.
Yeah, so tell me about that show.
So it's this live comedy show.
Okay.
Where comedians go up and they do 1 minute of stand-up.
Okay.
And then they get roasted by Tony Hinchcliffe and Joe Rogan.
Right.
And it's just this really raw, unfiltered, unpredictable show. Yeah. And it's really popular.
Yeah, and it's on Netflix now.
Yeah, it's on Netflix.
So it's even more accessible to people.
Yeah.
And they talked about how it's really helped to launch the careers of a lot of comedians, like Cam Patterson, William Montgomery, David Lucas.
Yeah. They've all been on Kill Tony. Yeah. And it's definitely helps them to get more exposure and to build their fan bases.